Americans, and citizens of the world. And this is part 2 of Fiona, the White Zulu's article about lightning and storms. Now, the first one, she talked about the Zulu's fear of lightning. Now, in this one, she's talking about getting caught in a storm. When I got tired of riding by myself, I would go to the next farm, about 5 miles away, to visit a boy I'd met at my younger sister's birthday party. The one and only birthday party ever held for any of us, when I was 9. His name was John, and he was a year younger than I was. He had his own shaggy Basutu pony, and I called in regularly on Rocket, stopping in their driveway to wait while John saddled up his pony and rode out to meet me. Together we'd spend the whole morning out and raced along the dusty district road on the straight flat bits. I always beat him, of course, because Rocket had been sired by a racehorse and could move like the wind. I'd sit there, one hand on my horse's rump, waiting mockingly while John's pony puffed towards me at its top speed. Then, just as he thought he'd caught up, I'd move off at another gallop. It was great fun, and I spent most of the time riding with my new friend. We swam our horses in my father's dam when it got really hot, and tethered them in the shade of the wattle tree to graze on the tender green reed grass near the water, while we stripped down to our brooks and splashed around the water to cool off, stirring up fine mud from the bottom and making those dad chicks run away from the surface, shrilling with fright. John and I even tried to make ourselves a canoe out of 3 sheets of corrugated iron, but naturally it promptly sank to the bottom of the dam to lie there in the silt. One day a great white thunderhead of cloud began building up behind the hills at midday, slightly earlier than usual, and as the clouds billowed into an anvil shape, they slowly turned to a charcoal color, then darkened to olive green, and we saw flashes of lightning and heard rumbles as the storm gathered momentum on its way down towards us from the Drakensberg. "We should get home quickly," said John, worried. "This storm is going to catch us out in the open if we don't hurry. You'd better come to my house as it's closer." We galloped over the veld to his house just ahead of the breaking storm and quickly led our horses into an open stable. "They'll be fine there," he said, and closed the half door behind us before we ran to the kitchen door, trying to dodge through the first few big drops of rain. "It looks as if it might hail. The sky's gone the greenish color," said his mother, who had been standing in the kitchen, anxiously watching the approaching storm and waiting for us to get in the house. "Would you like us to stay for lunch? I'll give your mum a ring and tell her you're safe, but I'll have to let the storm pass first in case the line gets hit by lightning while we're talking." The 4 of us sat around their dining room table and ate spaghetti and mince with tomato sauce and grated cheese on top. I knew John's dad from the cattle sales. He didn't play polo and was a quiet man, with a typical farmer's tan. His face, arms and legs burned brown from working out in the sun all the time. When he took off his bush hat, his face was white above the brow. He didn't have a farm manager like my father did, and worked hard, spending his days out among his sheep and cattle. Sometimes he was on horseback, with John at his side on his pony. Other times I'd seen him out in his bucky, checking the stock, his sweat-stained bush hat pulled well down to keep the blazing sun out of his eyes. John would be perched on the tailgate with a couple of their dogs running beside, pink tongues lolling out as they panted through the dust. Mr. Durant told me to call him Jimmy and asked all sorts of questions about my horse. Nobody did that at home, and I found myself enjoying chatting to these amicable grown-ups with John. I was used to being relegated to the nursery for meals with my sister, supervised by Evelina. As far as my parents were concerned, children were neither to be seen nor heard, like with Queen Victoria. The storm raged overhead, and instinctively we ducked, as flashes of lightning struck the conductor on their tin roof with a loud crack, immediately followed by the explosion of thunder right there in the room. Huge hailstones rattled down on the tin roof, so hard that the noise was a deafening roar. "Look!" shouted John, pointing out of the window after one particularly violent crash, his voice only just audible above the noise. "Look at that tree!" A tall gum tree that stood outside the house had been struck and had split in half down the middle. As volatile eucalyptus sap boiled and exploded, blue smoke and steam rose from the gashed and splintered center where the bolt had hit. And there was the same smell that came through from the shotgun cartridges after my mother had taken a pot shot at the baboons. Eventually the storm moved on, and the noise gradually abated. We sat for a while, watching it grumble its way towards Zion's bush on the horizon. "Well, what a good thing you two weren't caught in that," exclaimed John's mum. And she went to ring our farm. Their phone was exactly like ours, a small wooden box on the wall with two shiny metal dome-shaped bells on top, and they were on the same party line as we were. I watched as she lifted the black bakelite receiver from its hook and listened to hear if there was anyone using the line. Then she cranked the little black handle on the side of the box twice for two short rings, and then one for one long one. That was our ring. There were 12 farms, including the Umgeni Poor Convent, sharing that one line, and we all had our own Morse code ring. 10112? Hello, Doffy. I just wanted to tell you that Fiona's here safe and sound, and that she's had some lunch with us. Oh yes, I'll tell her. Really? Right now? Bye. She stood there for a moment, blinking, still holding the receiver and staring at it with what looked like dismay or disbelief. Then she placed it slowly back on the hook. Your mother wants you to go home right now, she said to me. There seems to be some sort of problem. Although I told her you were fine here with us. Personally, I would like the road to have dried up a bit before you set off. It will be really slippery out there. I had a hollow sinking feeling in my stomach as I followed John through the puddles to fetch Rocket from their stable. Hailstones the size of golf balls lay scattered around on the ground and piled up like snowbanks in corners of their yard where they'd bounced off the roof. I hope everything is okay at home for you, he said quietly. Just be careful in the mud. I let Rocket pick his own way along the road home. There had been a couple of inches of hard rain, and in some parts runnels of churning water formed a foaming stream on either side of the slippery red mud hump in the middle of the road. Now and again his hooves slithered from under him, making him sit right down on his haunches, but he was sure-footed enough to regain his equilibrium, and we carried on home. The roaring, frothing Umgeni River thundered down our valley, bursting with a sudden extra rain, and had overflown its banks. The level had already reached the top of the bridge, and little waves slopped over the edge and onto the concrete causeway. I felt a jolt of alarm when an uprooted tree trunk hit the middle pillar hard as it was washed underneath by the torrent. The impact made the whole bridge shudder, and I nudged Rocket into a canter to get over as fast as possible, in case the whole thing gave away while we were still on it. Evelina was standing on the back veranda when I got home, twisting her white cotton pinny anxiously in her brown hands. "How? Where have you been?" she called. "Nkosikazi is very, very angry. She's been shouting." I paused to wash my muddy bare feet under the tap that stood outside the kitchen, and hastily wiping them on the doormat, ran into the house. Both my parents were waiting for me in the glazine, and my mother turned on me as I skidded into the room. "I've just been speaking to Mrs. Durant," she said in a tight voice. I could see she was furious. My father looked at me coldly from his armchair. Both his hands gripped the arms, and his newspaper had fallen to the floor. "What do you think you were doing?" my mother raged. "What were you doing hanging around their place?" Before I could answer, my father added, "You have this whole ruddy great farm to ride on. You're not, and I repeat, not to go anywhere near our neighbours." His face was red with anger. I stood there stunned and opened my mouth to explain about the storm. "But," I started. My father interrupted. "Do you hear me? You are never to ride anywhere but on this farm." I nodded dumbly. I couldn't understand why, but I knew that if I argued I'd be in worse trouble than I already was. I padded out of the room, puzzled and feeling slightly sick with fright. What had I done wrong? We knew the Durrants, and John had been to our house to a birthday party, but that was all. Neither he nor his parents had ever been invited over on any other occasion, even though they lived on the next-door farm. In fact, the only time I'd ever heard their name mentioned was when my mother described her as that dumpy little woman next door. Why? What did they mean? I mooched sullenly around the farm for the next few days, riding Rocket along all the boundaries. It took a day to get the furthest hill, up at the very top of the ranch, and seething, I plodded my horse beside the fence line. I stared out the world beyond the barbed wire fence and gazed unseen at locust bodies, the corpses of grasshoppers, small rodents, and even tiny birds left impaled on the barbs by butcher birds, the small black and white fiscal shrikes we knew as the Jackie Hangman. They used the fence as a larder, the same way as they employed long thorns stabbing the still twitching bodies of their prey onto their spikes and returning to feed on them later. On several of my solitary rides, I saw 5 or 6 vultures circling high overhead in the blue-white brassy sky. There had to be a dead sheep or a carcass in one of my father's animals up in the hills somewhere, and normally I'd have ridden up the pass to find the death and report it to him. But I ignored the carrion eaters and kept on riding the boundary fences. I raged inside, angry, puzzled, and above all, lonely. I pondered over and over and over again about the blistering dressing down I'd received for riding over to the Durants. All I wanted was a bit of company. Both my older sisters, most of their time at boarding school, and my younger sister showed no interest in riding. Admittedly, the first ride I ever took her on a year before, when she was 5, she'd fallen off old Sonny at the end of our front drive, just beyond the cattle grid, and hurt her right arm. She'd been pretty reluctant about going riding in the first place, and desperate for company. I'd implored her to give it a try. She toppled off as the old she sucked on my headset on. Okay, I apologize. I had my headset on. It's been a long day. Okay. But let's get back to the story. Now, this is the full me without the headset, okay? Admittedly, the ride I ever took her on a year before she was 5, she'd fallen off old Sonny at the end of our front drive, just before the cattle grid, and hurt her right arm. She had been pretty reluctant about going riding in the first place, and desperate for company. I'd implored her to give it a try. She toppled off as the old moke was ambling along at a snail's pace behind me, and I'd given her grandpa's treatment, sitting back on Prince and telling her to get back on. I yelled at her, "Hurry up, or you'll lose your nerve and never ride again," repeating his old, well-tested mantra. I'd been riding since I was at 3, and it had always worked for me. Howling with pain and blinded by tears, she'd stumbled home on foot, clutching her arm, and I sighed, leaned over and collected up Sonny's reins to lead him back to the stables. Mum was very angry. "I'm fed up with you, and the way you treat your little sister," she shouted at me as Evelina helped my still sobbing sister into the back of the car. My mother had hastily applied lipstick in the driving mirror before she ran the gear stick forward, and they took off the drive in a flurry of dust to get to the doctor's surgery 20 miles away. Later that evening they'd arrived home, my sister's broken arm in a sling and set with stark white plaster of Paris. Do you remember that plaster of Paris? Apparently they've got new stuff nowadays, but we used to, when it happened at boarding school at Michael House of Cornwallis, everybody used to autograph it and you'd have all these signatures on it. But anyway, let's carry on. She was enjoying the drama far too much for my liking, as everyone in the kitchen fussed over her, shaking their heads and clicking with sympathy. I remember our domestic lady always used to click. I glared at her as she sat smugly at the nursery table while Evelina cut up her food into little pieces so she could eat using a fork with her left hand. "It's all your fault," she started. Having any kind of ammunition, justified or otherwise, against me was a rare occasion for her, and she wasn't going to pass it up. But I certainly wasn't going to listen to any moral lectures from her. An apology from me was out of the question, and I wasn't even going to give her an opportunity to find her sentence. "It was your own stupid fault," I retorted. "You're just a useless rider. Can't even stay on an old Sonny." And that was that. The end of my sister's riding career. That's so sad. Fear, that's naughty. Inevitably, after I'd saddled up my horse and roamed up to the far boundaries of the farm, after what I considered particularly unfair treatment by Mum and Dad, fuming at their stupidity, I would eventually be seduced by the sheer beauty of the surroundings. It was therapeutic to pull up from a long gallop, walk rocket down the bank of the Amgani River till he was belly high in the water, allowing him to regain his strength and take a drink, while I slipped my feet out of my stirrups and dangled my legs down his sweating flanks, dabbling my toes in the swift, cool current. Then we would plod home along a cattle path that followed the contours of the riverbank. As usual, the thud of Rocket's hoofbeats in the soft dust was barely audible against the background noise of the water, as it poured smoothly over granite boulders. The river rushed past rocks and tinkled as it trickled in smaller, sparkling rills, to flow underneath dark green ferns, wild blue agapanthus, red-hot pokers, and white arum lilies, which hung down from the mossy banks. The river tumbled off the edge of the plateau in frothy white cascades to settle down, filling its rocky bed with pristine crystal clear water. The Umgeni flowed the length of the farm, along the valley floor, its right bank grassy and the left one covered by the dense indigenous bush. From the forest on the opposite bank I heard occasional quite, quite, quite alarm calls from the lime-green Naisnaluris and caught a glimpse of a pair of flapping from one tree branch to another, revealing for a moment a startling flash of bright scarlet beneath their broad wings. About the size of a toucan, they perched clumsily, rocking comically backwards and forwards, raising their bright green crests and cocked an eye, exquisitely outlined in white, at me. We also had purple-crested lories living in the bush, which had a very unusual occurrence. The latter, preferably a warm climate, and are indigenous to the South African coastal areas from the Cape right up to Mozambique. Apparently, according to the many ornithologists who regularly visit us to observe endangered birds, like the watered crane and other very rare bird species, the natural bush on our farm is the only known area where these species occur. Our flays on the top of the breeding habitat of South Africa, only 3 crane species, the rare and highly endangered wattle crane, as well as the blue crane, which is our national bird, and the crowned crane. It is most unusual, if not unknown, for all 3 types of crane to occur in one place in South Africa. A flock of common waxbills erupted from the short brown grass next to our path. Tiny, smaller than even the English wren, they feed on fallen grass seeds in vast numbers, showing only their brown backs and resembling nothing more than small dry brown leaves, drifting across the dusty earth in a light breeze. When startled, the tiny birds whir up in a twittering cloud to perch clinging sideways to dry grass stalks. Only then do they reveal their crimson faces and rose-coloured breast feathers. Blue-billed firefinches are spectacularly cherry red. Apart from their speckled brown wings, frequently join these feeding parties. Such a flurry of bright red, pink and brown exploding from our feet never failed to take my breath away, although Rocket barely cast an ear in their direction. What made him start, snorting with alarm and enough head-tossing to jingle his bit, was a grey heron that rose spectacularly in front from the water's edge with a loud quack and sailed off indignantly, its long legs trailing behind. The noise of the river drowned out the sound of our approach, allowing us to come within a few yards of a big 80-strong troop of our resident baboons, resting from the baking heat in the shade of the huge Natal fig tree, growing on our side of the river. I pulled Rocket back and allowed him to drop his head, reins hanging loose as he pulled at tufts of sweet pinkish-brown felt grass on the path's edge. I watched quietly, leaning comfortably back, one hand resting on his glossy brown rump and the other lightly on his neck, my fingers curled around his smooth, damp leather of the reins. We were hidden on our side of the tree, in duppies of shade cast by the massive fig, whose gnarled and twisted roots grew right down to the water's edge, in and among boulders on the riverbank, and lying half exposed like great grey ropes. No matter how sour and resentful I felt, I had to laugh at the games the baby baboons played, while their mothers dozed, heads nodding sleepily as they relaxed against the massive tree trunk. A little one swung from a low branch by his front paws, another jumped up to grab his tail and hang there, followed by more and more, until there was a bunch of babies swinging from one tail. When the first baboon let go, there'd be a soft whoomp, as they all fell gently onto the earth beneath the tree, sending up quite a puff of dust. Then they rolled around, play-biting, squealing and mock fight and pouncing on one another to tumble around before racing off and up the tree again. I chuckled at the tranquil domestic scene and watched until Rocket grew restless, and I rowed him away from the river and through a gully where, judging from the freshly ploughed effect of grassy slopes there, bush pigs had spent last night busily rooting for arum lily bulbs and insect larvae. For the second time that afternoon I was glad I hadn't brought the dogs. Apart from disturbing the baboon troop, they could never resist bush pig spoor, and once they scented them, they were off for hours, deaf to my calls and whistles. I jogged home, released Rocket into his paddock, and stood and watched him roll all four legs into the air as he writhed and twisted to ease the itch of sweat off his back. He got to his feet, front legs stuck out clownishly as he sat up like a dog, before he heaved himself up and shook vigorously, sending clouds of reddish-brown dust flying off his coat. Then I walked barefoot up the sloping dirt track, which wound beneath a clump of massive gum trees to the cluster of round thatched mud huts, one of which was Locatia's. She was always ready to drop whatever she was doing to spend time with me. I stuck my head in through her wooden doorway and breathed in the atmosphere I knew so well. The ever-present scent of wood smoke from years of fires, built in the circle of large stones on the shiny floor in the middle of her hut. She and her daughter Bongi worked hard on that floor, spreading a mixture of wet cow dung and mud over the entire area with their bare hands, smoothing the paint-like mixture with their fingers and leaving it to dry. The effect was that of a well-laid cement, and the pair of them polished it to a high gloss with pads of sheepskin on their hands and knees, the same way that housemaids buffed our yellowwood floors with cobra floor shine. The wood smoke almost, but not quite, overwhelmed the scent of khaki weed, that delicious, pungent, medicinal-smelling herb with which the Zulus stuffed their sacking mattresses, along with dry hay cut from soft felt grass. "It keeps fleas away," Locatia said, and now and again we had an infestation in the farmhouse, usually after I'd smuggled a stable cat into my bedroom. I'd climb in through my window, clutching the struggling cat, plonk it on my bed, and stroke it until the half-wild creature submitted and settled, purring and kneading my blanket, while the fleas leaped joyfully and unnoticed into my bedding. Evelina would take her sickle out to one of the paddocks and return with an armful of fresh khaki weed to stuff under my mattress, and I could sleep unmolested by fleas, drifting off with its almost peppery medicinal scent infiltrating my dream. I sat with Acacia on grass mats, our backs resting against her sun-baked mud walls. Faces turned to the warmth of the late afternoon sun. We drank strong, aromatic coffee out of enamel mugs, topped up with creamy milk and crunchy brown government sugar, and worked doorsteps of white bread into doughy sausage shapes, my hands still grimy with a combination of horse sweat and red dust. To Sheba, dipped them in to suck the sweet, rich coffee from it. I unloaded all my frustrations on her, and she clucked, "Ow, Inkosizakani," as she listened intently to all my problems and clicked her tongue and shook her head in sympathy at the injustice of it all. Between these cathartic interludes, it was easy for me to avoid Mum and Dad, except for the occasional mealtimes. These were bearable only because of their brevity, and the fact that Dad never allowed controversial discussions at the table, so we could eat quickly and quietly and vanish, slipping away, again to roam the farm until dark. That's the end of the next session of the White Zulu. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Ring the bell for the updates. Please like this video. Please share this video. And above all, please stay safe. Bye for now.